guys, and welcome back to the channel. This is my first recorded video since I got home from the Scrabble Players Championship held in Maryland last week. So before I jump into the content, I want to talk a little bit about my experience at the tournament, and also give you guys a little bit of a roadmap for what you can expect on my channel in the coming days and weeks. As far as the tournament goes, as you guys know, I was really hoping to defend my title from last year. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite able to do that, but I came very close, and I'm still super happy with how I played and very pleased with my second place finish. As Nationals often is, it was quite a roller coaster for me. The first couple of days went really well. I finished 6-1 each of the first 2 days and jumped out to an early lead over the field after the first half of the tournament. However, day 3 was not so smooth. As is typical when you're at the top of a D1 at Nationals, I was playing a lot of other very good Scrabble players who were extremely eager to win. And I ended up having a more difficult day, starting 1-4 and thankfully winning my last 2 games to at least salvage a 3-4 record. But by that point, my lead over the rest of the field was extremely small going into the pivotal day 4. And day 4 started out really well. I had an excellent morning, and going into the 3-game afternoon session, it was pretty apparent that all I needed to do to clinch my spot in the best-of-5 finals was to win one of my final 3 games, which I felt I should be able to do, but certainly wasn't taking for granted, and it wasn't easy. In my first of those 3 games, I got paired against my eventual finals opponent, Nigel Peltier, and in a really tense back-and-forth game, I ended up losing by 2 points in a very difficult pre-endgame and endgame that I will at some point be discussing at length on my YouTube channel. And after that, I got rewarded for that difficult loss by having to play none other than the GOAT Nigel Richards. That was an interesting game, but I didn't have too many great chances and ended up losing to Nigel Richards in game 27, setting up a very dramatic situation in round 28, the last round before the 2 finalists were decided, where we had 2 winner-take-all games. One game was played between myself and longtime top Texan expert Chris Cree. The other game was played between the 2 Nigels, Nigel Peltier and Nigel Richards. And the winners of these 2 games would play for the title in a best-of-5 match on the following day. In the end, I managed a narrow win against Chris Cree, and Nigel Peltier managed to defeat Nigel Richards, setting up a best-of-5 showdown between myself and Nigel Peltier for the title. So an absolute whirlwind of a final day, when things went from looking really good to all of a sudden looking very precarious, and I was barely able to squeak out my spot in the finals in the end. So quite a bit of an emotional roller coaster, but I had to quickly regroup and get myself ready for the big showdown against Nigel Peltier the next day, since Nigel being as strong of a player as he is, that was not going to be an easy task. And then the ensuing best-of-5 finals, which I'm guessing most of you guys all watched, happened. And it was a really exciting series that, as you guys know, unfortunately didn't end up going my way, but huge kudos and congratulations to Nigel Peltier. He played an awesome series and has been finishing in the top 10 of Nationals really consistently for many years. Also a really great and gracious guy, so super happy for him, and big congratulations to him on his win. But what I'm going to do, guys, this week is kind of like I did last year in my best-of-5 match that I did manage to win. I'm going to go over each of my 5 games against Nigel Peltier in the finals in detail. Now, some of these games were a little bit closer and more interesting than others, so the videos might not be equal in length between one another, just based on how much there is to dive into for that game, but I'm still going to give each game a thorough analysis and go over kind of what I was thinking on each play. So that's going to take up this week. Going forward, starting next week, I'm going to more or less go back to my usual regimen involving best spot games as well as my Collaborative series against HastyBot, and on the 2 off days, so to speak, Tuesday and Thursday, I'm going to probably be doing deep dive analyses of some of my other memorable or important games throughout the championships. One other game I definitely want to cover that I mentioned before is my 2-point loss to Nigel Peltier in the main event. I certainly want to go over my 2 games against the other Nigel, Nigel Richards, the greatest Scrabble player of all time, and there were several other interesting situations and games I'll probably want to cover as well as some games and notable moments that didn't necessarily involve me. As, yes, while I had a lot of cool things happen at this event, there were also some pretty wild and entertaining games that happened between other players, and I want to make sure to give those their due respect as well. So that's kind of what's going to be happening, guys, on my channel for the next week and the next couple of weeks going forward. I hope you guys are excited. Thanks so much for listening as always, and now let's go ahead and jump in to an analysis of Game 1 of the best-of-5 finals match between myself and Nigel Peltier. Alrighty guys, so jumping right in, I get to go first in the odd number games as a result for having the better record during the main event on spread. And my opening rack for the finals is EEEMOPT. And here, maybe due to jitters or something else, I actually made a little bit of an inaccuracy. I quickly found the word that is clearly correct for me to play of metope and played it over here for 26 points. And this is fine, but it's a little bit imprecise because it gives Nigel a huge scoring spot next to the O, the P, and the E. I'm putting two vowels in close proximity next to double underscores, so if Nigel has one or multiple 4+ point tiles, he's going to be able to get a pretty big overlap down the I or G columns, possibly getting nearly 40 points, or if he has something like the X, even more than that. A little bit smarter for me would have been to place the same word here for the same score of 26 points. And why this is better is because it does create the same kind of hotspots with the vowels next to the double underscores, but it separates them. And now the advantage is if Nigel uses one of the E's that are next to the double underscores, I'm often going to get to use the other, instead of placing them both in close proximity like I did, which is often going to yield Nigel one big score without giving me counterplay. I think what I was thinking here is this placement might lead to a more open board in the long term, because it tends to lean closer to the top left part of the board, which is notoriously known in Scrabble for becoming shut. And I generally was hoping for a more open board against Nigel, since he tends to prefer closed boards, but this is still a little bit of an overreaction, I think, as we will see on Nigel's next turn, since he capitalized very nicely on my inaccuracy, making what appears to be easily his best play of Opa for 38 points. Like I said, doubling the P and doubling the H in both directions and accumulating a very nice score, while keeping, of course, an awesome leave in AB blank. I have a bit of a clunky draw in response, pulling 3 pairs of duplicates, 2 Ds, 2 Es, and 2 Ls, and I make what looks like a pretty solid play of Del for 26 points, scoring nicely, taking out a new hotspot that Nigel just created, and leaving a nice leave of C, D, E, L. Another option I considered was seated in the same spot, which scores 6 more points, but keeps the duplicate L, which is a lot weaker, and it looks like the clear choice is Del, which I played for 26, giving up 6 points, but keeping a much better leave for the next turn. Nigel, fortunately for me, has a bit of a poor draw to his leave of A, B blank, pulling I, O, O, V, and he's forced to clean up his rack with above for 20 points, which looks to be pretty clearly his best option. I have a promising rack here, but no playable bingos, and I think there's a chance that Nigel might be trying to set up his X with above for a big play making Ox, so I decided to take out that scoring spot while getting a nice 31 points myself for Coled. Another fun option I did consider was extending Pal to Pal and Node to the triple for 36 points. So this does score 5 more points, but it gives back far more counterplay to Nigel. And I'm in a good enough position here, I decide I don't need to take that chance. I'm going to take my 31, keep a nice IN leave, and see what Nigel does on his next turn. And Nigel does make a statement on his next turn, getting down the first bingo of the game and of the finals match, Booties and Metopes for 77 points, which is clearly his best play. Fortunately for me, I pull the other blank, and I'm able to bingo right back to stay in the game, with Dinting for 79 points, making Opt and Pally. I could play the more common Denting in the same spot, but this is 1 fewer point, as it forces me to overlap using my blank as opposed to my 1 point I, so Dinting is clearly better. And Nigel responds here with the nice play of Jomon for 44 points, retaining his S and scoring well with his J. He did actually have one play here that's tough to see, that is probably a bit better, Jimson making 3 overlaps above, scoring 61. Now this does get rid of his S, but it is 17 more points, which is probably a little bit too much to justify giving up for the sake of keeping an S. So perhaps a little bit of an oversight here by Nigel, but in any case, Jomon's still a very nice play. And I have a decent draw after my bingo, EEFIOTZ. I thought for a little while here, considering some options that used my Z and some that didn't. I don't have anything amazing here, and I end up settling on my highest scoring option of Fez next to Nigel's last play for 42. 42 is a nice score, but I'm really not a huge fan of EIOT as a leave, since I'm often going to end up with a vowel-heavy rack without the ability to score a lot of points on my next turn. So I strongly considered instead playing Footy for 26 points, keeping the Z as a scoring tile. I especially was thinking I might end up drawing into something like Phase or Fuse from the F in Footy for 48 to the triple on my next turn, given the 7 A's and 4 U's still unseen. However, I felt that there was a decent chance Nigel was going to use that F himself, and I often wasn't going to be able to get a great return for my Z on the next play. So with Fez being 16 more points immediately and more defensive, I felt that was a little bit too much to give up, which seems like a reasonable call. So with this play, I go up by 25, but it's Nigel's turn and it's still a very close game. Nigel has a poor draw after Jomon pulling 2 U's out of the bag, and here he makes a very nice play. An aggressive play, but I think a very good one. Guru for 10, keeping a very potent AIN sleeve and setting up potentially devastating bingos, hooking Gurus on the triple on his next turn. And this now forces me to make a decision. I also have an S that I've just drawn after Fez, but I have almost no good plays that use the S in a way that seems justifiable. I'm not going to play something like Iotas over here for 12 points just to block that spot. After all, I'm barely up and I can't afford to make such big concessions at this point in the game. So instead, I decide to keep the pressure on with Iota and all for 16 points, keeping my own S and basically hoping to beat Nigel in the race to a big play or a bingo with Gurus. It's a bit risky, especially since I feel like Nigel almost certainly has his own S after Guru, but like I said, I'm not willing to make huge concessions at this score and this point in the game to block that spot that Nigel may or may not be able to capitalize on in a big way. Another option that I briefly considered was the more fishy AI for 13 points, but EIOST is a very risky leaf because if I draw a bingo, it's great, but if I don't draw a bingo, especially if I pull more low pointers or vowels, I'm really in a tough spot on my next turn. So I decided to go with the slightly lower variance approach with Iota, which is a decision I think makes a lot of sense. Nigel, fortunately for me, does draw one of those dreaded racks with all one pointers that doesn't make a playable bingo. And with no ability to score points, Nigel decides to go all in here on beating me to the all-important bingo with Gurus. He plays LI for just 10 points. Yes, he'd love to score more than 10, but he also doesn't really want to play Raisin for 27 and kind of concede to being down a turn in a worse position. He decides to keep the pressure on and keep a very nice AINRS leaf, which is going to give him great bingo chances, especially with 7 E's still remaining in the unseen pool. I agree with his decision here. And I do draw a playable bingo. Unfortunately for me, it's not with Gurus, but I'm still happy to get a bingo, Ravisher for 66 points. The game is far from over here, though, as Nigel could still easily hit a bingo with Gurus and get right back into it. But fortunately for me, he misses and draws a Y and an A out of the bag. At this point, Nigel is down almost 90 and desperately needs to bingo as soon as possible, so he plays off his Y and his A, keeping the best leaf possible once again, and hoping to hit something with Gurus on his next turn, which makes a lot of sense. And I am far from out of the woods here, guys. Yes, I'm in a good position. I'm up 65, but the Gurus threat is still looming large, and with my clunky draw involving the Q, it's going to be very difficult to block it. I strongly consider making a play like Veg to obstruct Gurus. However, there are a couple problems with this play. Number one, yes, it blocks Gurus, but now it potentially allows Nigel a very high-scoring bingo to the G I've just opened in Veg. Especially with 3 I's and 3 N's left, the likelihood of Nigel making a 8-letter word ending in ING reaching the top right triple for 80 to 90 points is very significant. So I balk a little bit at creating that opening. I'm also nervous that after Veg, if Nigel bingos, I'm going to still be stuck having to deal with the Q and have no good way to respond to whatever scoring spots his bingo might open. So I decide here to prioritize getting rid of my Q for 25, figuring I give him one more shot to hit Gurus right now, and if he doesn't hit it immediately, I'll block that spot and more or less lock up the game. It was a difficult decision, but I think my logic here makes a lot of sense. Another benefit of QI is that I do block the second bingo line that Nigel created with his earlier play of LI, namely on the 2-row hooking it. And once again, I get a break in that Nigel misses his fish for the 3rd consecutive turn, drawing the F and the U out of the bag. And here, Nigel plays Fur for 30 points. It's a very difficult position for him, because while Fur does score 30 points, the issue is it doesn't really open a new threat. And now the problem for Nigel is if I block Gurus, it's going to be very difficult for him to bingo, and it's almost impossible to see him winning this game without bingoing. So, in some ways, it would make more sense for Nigel to open another line. However, it's very difficult for Nigel to do so. And he's also down 90. He has to keep scoring because he doesn't want to fall so far behind that even if he does eventually bingo, it's not going to be enough. So I can't really fault Nigel for taking his 30 points and hoping I maybe can't adequately block Gurus. But fortunately for me, I can. And I make what I think here was a very astute play. The most obvious choice is Vug for 21, clearing out my 2 worst tiles on my rack, the U and the G. However, this has the same problem I was talking about on my last turn. I really don't want to put a G there in open space that Nigel can use for an ING bingo. So instead, I sacrifice a decent amount of equity playing Vow for 3 points fewer and keeping the normally clunky G. But the thing is, it's much more difficult for Nigel to bingo through a U. It's almost impossible for him to end in a U and get to the triple, and if he's able to play through the U at all, which isn't going to be easy to do, he's only going to be scoring most likely in the low 60s, which I'll still be in a good position if he's able to get down. So this is a position where I feel like I'm almost a guarantee to win if Nigel doesn't bingo, so I should go all out on minimizing the chances that he bingos, and when he does bingo, restricting him to weak 60-point options that I can most likely outrun. So this, I think, was a very strong play on my part. And Nigel here makes another very nice play. He draws poorly after for pulling the K, the X, and another N, and he scores well with an X for 37, getting rid of his X, staying well within range, and hoping maybe he can make a good setup for his S on a future turn that I might struggle to block. And on my next play here, I make another play I'm very proud of. My first instinct was to play Gyrate for 28 points, but I balked a little bit about leaving the E hook on an X open, because Nigel could potentially make a play down to the bottom right triple, since, again, I'm still pretty confident he has an S for Gurus. I don't think he would have played Guru without an S, and he hasn't used it yet. So I'm a little bit worried about the prospect of Nigel playing down there and creating another huge threat that might be annoying for me to address. So I decided instead to sacrifice a couple points and play Rugate for 22, which stops Nigel from creating a threat in that part of the board, and also keeps my Y, which in this case I'm actually happy to do since it's a good scoring tile. Remember, I don't need to bingo at this point. I'm up 60 points after my play. My main goal is to prevent Nigel from bingoing, or if Nigel is somehow able to bingo, keep enough scoring power in reserve to outrun his bingo. And the Y on this kind of closed board is a very good tile for doing that, as it's worth 4 points, and it's pretty easy to use with many of the tiles in the unseen pool. So I think this was another really strong play on my part. And here, Nigel is in another very difficult position. At this point, it's pretty obvious to both of us that Nigel is not winning this game unless he bingos, and he makes what I think is another very strong play here, trying to set up a bingo line Zek for 26 points. This gives him the potential to play a 7-letter word under the K using his I for KI, and if I don't have the A or the I that are remaining in the unseen pool, I'm not going to be able to play under the K, and I might struggle to block this. It's not that likely I won't have either, but this is absolutely a risk Nigel has to take if he wants any chance to win this game. And in a good stroke of luck for Nigel, I don't have either the A or the I. So his play of Zek definitely gets me sweating a little bit, as I'm looking at a pretty strong unseen tile pool with an A and 2 I's, at least one of which I'm sure Nigel has. And I feel like I really need to block this at all costs, because if Nigel gets an 80+ point bingo there, I'm only up 37 now. That might easily be enough for him to win. So I make here what I think is another very solid play, Wee, for just 12 points. I have to be a little careful because I am losing ground to Nigel with each week's blocking play I make on the scoreboard. I was up close to 80 a couple turns ago. After Wee, I'm only going to be up about 50. But I still feel pretty confident in my ability to hold on to my 50-point lead on this tight a board, especially holding a nice scoring lead with an S and a Y in reserve. And while Wee doesn't make it entirely impossible for Nigel to bingo, he could still hit something like earnings from the E I just opened hooking KA. It makes it way, way less likely than if I leave that spot completely open for him to just play a 7. So this seems like a very solid play on my part, doing my best to address the spot while keeping a good set of scoring tiles in reserve. And Nigel makes another very astute play on his next turn, none for 3 points. Again, Nigel here recognizes that he's going to need to bingo to win this game, and none is a play that if I don't have the other S, which it turns out I do, but Nigel of course doesn't know that, could give me a lot of headaches. Because depending on what's in the bag, Nigel could maybe pull the G for cursing with nuns or the T for encrust, and if I don't have the other S, it might be difficult, or in some cases even impossible for me to do anything about that. Another very interesting idea for Nigel might have been to play Knit over here for just 3. And this sets up not only his S for snit, but also his U for unit. I'm not sure I think this is a better play though, as it's a little bit easier for me to block if I don't have the hook. I could, for instance, just play a 2-letter word next to the N, and that's going to pretty effectively take care of the opening Nigel just created, and it leave him very few viable paths to victory. So Nigel's play, I think, is a little bit better, because when I don't have that S, which again, Nigel has to count on if he wants any chance to win this game, it could be a real hassle for me to block. So I think this is a very nice play by Nigel, and he gave himself a great chance to steal this game. Unfortunately for Nigel, I already had the S, and not only that, I had drawn well after we, pulling a bingo of Tersely, which he now gave me a spot for. 88 points. This seals the deal for this game, but again, none was still a great play by Nigel. He gave himself a chance, and the beauty of the match play best of 5 format, which we're going to see as a recurring theme throughout our 5 games, is that point spread does not matter. Remember, during the main event, point spread is important because it's the tiebreaker in determining who finishes above other players if multiple people finish with the same win-loss record, which happens frequently. In a best-of-5 match, barring the highly unlikely event that we tie, point spread doesn't matter. So even if you risk getting blown out or losing by more, you always in this format want to give yourself the chance to win, which is exactly what Nigel did. At this point, it doesn't really matter since, again, spread doesn't make a difference. Nigel plays Cud for 19 points, and I block his outplay of Ferns from the F in Fur with Fig for 7, saving multiple spots to go out with Awe. Nigel responds with Mirans for 16 points. Nisi here would have been a little bit better, but again, it doesn't matter. And I go out with my highest scoring play of All for 19 and end up taking game 1 of the finals 479 to 352. A very well-played game to open the match. I think we each made one inaccuracy here. My opening play of Metope was misplaced, and he probably should have gone with Jimson over Jomon, but I think we both made some really sharp decisions. I was super happy with my plays of Vow and Rugate, and I think Nigel made some outstanding aggressive plays with Guru and Nun in particular to give himself a great chance to win this game, but fortunately for me, I was able to hold on and take a 1-0 lead going into Game 2. So a very interesting Game 1, highly strategic to start off the match. And yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Really hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought of this game in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for my analysis of game number 2. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.